Good day to you. Take a look at my shirt. Can you see these symbols? This shirt is from Mazatlan, Mexico, where I started the class out from. And this is a tourist type shirt. It's got surfboards and other kinds of waterfront type activities that they're in positions like they're acting out, these stick figures. But the figures themselves are actually very much like indigenous Mexican culture. They look like Aztecs. A lot of the ways that Aztecs, which was a group of indigenous peoples living in Mexico before the Spaniards got there, it makes the Aztecs on my shirt look like the Aztecs that supposedly existed back in 5,500 AD, 5,000 BC and later. So this is something about Mexico that introduces our chapter today, which is all about cultures and subcultures, or cultures within subcultures. And the indigenous peoples are not only in Mexico, but also in Canada and other parts of the world are addressed in this chapter. So as we head into this chapter, I just want to let you know I'm going to do some freewheeling today because I have a lot of my own ideas that I want to blend into what we're talking about here and leave some of the finer details to your reading in the book. So anyway, let's just start off with what a subculture is. It's a smaller culture within a culture. That's what a subculture is. And usually it's defined by geography, you know, where people live. Like we say Southerners in the United States, that's a geography, a geographic subculture. Or it's defined by ethnicity. We can say African Americans, for example, in the United States, or Latinos, or Latinas. If you don't know the difference between those two, one is saying males and females, the Latinos, and the other is saying just strictly females, Latinas. We can also say that economic and social class help to define subcultures. We can say, for example, people who are blue-collar workers have some characteristics that are different from people who have white-collar jobs. We can also say that people who come from parents who have never been to college have certain characteristics about them versus people who come from parents who have had a long line in college. Anyway, that's subcultures, and that's generally speaking how they're defined. Now, the book then goes on to discuss specific subcultures, and it does it in, I think, somewhat of an exclusive way, because it leaves out the idea of talking about, for example, baseball fans as a subculture, or hip-hop music fans as a subculture. Maybe it'll get to that later in the book, but right now it's talking mostly about ethnicities, and the first one that it discusses is the Hmong diaspora. Now, Hmong is that group of Asian peoples that came out of Laos. Laos was right next to Vietnam, and they were scattered all over the world. And diaspora is a word that you can kind of think of it as disperse. It's when a culture gets dispersed across the world. They leave whatever the home country is and they go out. That's a diaspora. We know that the Hmong people are living here in the United States. There's actually a dollar store down the road from ESU. I'm not sure if that is an example of Hmong people. I don't know them that well, but I'm fairly certain they are Vietnamese. I may be wrong, they may be Chinese, but I think they're Vietnamese. At any rate, you might have come across some Vietnamese stores, certainly in New York. I've eaten at a Vietnamese restaurant. The Hmong have some very different cultural values, and that's kind of what goes along with subcultures, is they preserve their own cultural values in the face of the larger culture's values, although sometimes there's a clash and they're forced to get rid of them. In the case of the Hmong, they sacrifice animals sometimes in houses where people are ill, and those animals can include dogs. And as the book has pointed out earlier in another chapter, the whole idea of what animals are appropriate to kill varies among cultures, right? We don't eat dogs in the United States. We consider that to be, quote, and this is going to sound funny, but inhumane. But in Korea, for sure, they eat dogs, and Vietnam as well, they eat dogs. You know, we have the untouchable animals like dogs, but we eat cows, chickens, etc. All right, so the Hmong is discussed quite a bit, and the way that they dispersed, I encourage you to dig into that. The next group that is discussed as a subculture is the Koreans in Russia. Koreans having left the Korean peninsula and migrated to certain southern Russian states, one of them being Uzbekistan, which is now a Muslim state, so it's creating a lot of, I don't know how to say it, but tension or some inhospitality for Koreans who are living in Russia. It's the name of the specific group is called the Koryo Saram, and they live in that lower tier of Russia as a subculture. Now, the next group you will have had familiarity with if you've spent any time in Pennsylvania, and even if you haven't, you know about them. It's the Amish. The Amish are a group of people that have very strict religious practices in regards to personal possessions and they're living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, and they're also living in Ohio. They came from Switzerland as a very strict religious sect, and we Westerners, we think of them as shunning technology. They don't want to use electricity, they don't want to use battery powers, etc. If you go through Amish country, you'll see houses with no electrical lines run up to them, and you'll see plowing done the old-fashioned way with animals and oxes and horses and cows, and you'll see them wearing their familiar attire of black and white and very, very specific colors that the women can wear. You'll see them in their horse coaches going through the countryside, the black horse coaches. On a Sunday, you always get stuck behind an Amish vehicle in Lancaster. I know this because I went to Millersville University and we saw the Amish all the time. And they have traditions that are unique to their culture. The Amish men cannot grow a beard until they're married. I think that's the way it goes. The beard is related to marriage in some way, shape, or form, and they don't drive automobiles. But it's not to say that they aren't adapting. Some sects of Amish actually do use battery-powered devices, radios, for example, but they do not get it from electricity. So what we have here is a culture that's existing right here in Pennsylvania. Is largely self-contained. And by the way, the Amish are very profitable as farmers. They are very profitable because they do not need to pay their families to farm. It's part of their work ethic. And so when you look at Cuckold and Stroudbeck's value orientation theory, Cuckold and Stroudbeck's value orientation theory is introduced in a prior chapter. Here in this chapter, it's applied. And the worldview, which would be the first dimension, if you now remember that, about the Amish, is submission, or as they say it in the Swiss Germanic term, it's Gelassenheit. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly there. Submission to God. God is in everything. God is in almost every statement they make. Religion is taught in the house, not specifically in a church, though it can be taught in a church. And you're serving God with everything that you're doing. So the worldview is all about the Amish God. Their activity orientation, which is the next value orientation from this theory, is most important. You're able to finish the 8th grade going to school in an Amish school, not the American education system, but the Amish education system, and you're expected to go to work on the farm. And so the whole family is working all day long on the farm, and that's why it's so cheap for them to have the labor to produce the food that they do. The next value is human nature. I've already mentioned it, but they do have their own education system, and the U.S. government has allowed them to do so. So they are learning the old-fashioned way through books. Some Amish, younger Amish, use cell phones, but even then, the way that they talk on their cell phones is through friending only other Amish people. I can tell you that I had an Amish female student living in my dormitory, and she was shunned by the Amish community. That's a very specific word that's used. She was not spoken to. That's how strict they are if you don't follow their teachings and the teachings of God exactly. She was shunned because she was deaf, and she wanted to have a hearing aid, and the hearing aid went against the Amish religion, so they prohibited her from having a hearing aid. She took one anyhow, and she was willing to accept being ostracized or shunned from the Amish community. All right, and then finally there's relational orientation. Relational orientation as a value in the Amish is all about the family. The family means anything. Anything that destroys the family is not allowed. That's how they characterize their technology. The bicycle that they've designed does not have air in the tires. The thinking is that you can ride an Amish bicycle only as far as a coach can travel. Anything which would be possible by the automobile is going to break up the family. And we'll have kids moving down the shore, or kids moving to California. So the Amish design everything around their relational orientation to each other, which is everything is about the family. The idea of the United States now is what is taken up next in the book, and we talk about the indigenous cultures a little bit. I'm going to step off of the book's plan for this subject right now for a moment by talking once again about the indigenous populations and comparing them to Canada and the United States and Mexico. In the United States, we have a very clear history of terminating our indigenous populations, the Indians. We portrayed them as very warlike in most respects. We put them on reservations. We put them on the Trail of Tears, taking them through some of the most inhospitable terrain. We put them on reservations, also in inhospitable terrains, in the desert or very cold of North Dakota. We were at war with them for many years, and so it's very difficult. That entire population, as a pure population, finding just a pure Indian is almost completely wiped out, or any trace of it. So that's the way that we treated our indigenous cultures in the United States. And though we still have relics of symbols that speak to indigenous populations, like if you go to Shawnee Golf Course, you'll see the head of an Indian as part of their logo, a male Indian, I should say. For the most part, we don't see that culture within our culture on a daily basis. Now that's different in Canada. Canada, they were the indigenous peoples were put onto a kind of reservation, but they were not eliminated. They were not exterminated. They were not waged war against. So you do have Indians, Inuits, and Eskimos. They are indigenous peoples living in their whole entire areas. Part of Northumberland is one of the provinces of Canada. Canada is built on provinces, not states. Houses Inuit Indians. It's just for them. So you have a similar idea with the U.S. They're put in pockets, but they are better cared for and were not exterminated, to put it harshly. In Mexico, you have yet an even different system. The indigenous peoples are still very present in Mexican life, and you still see symbolism like this wherever you go in Mexico. You see people who look like they could have been living, 5,000 years ago when you go to Mexico. Very dark skin, very old and wise looking in their faces, hand-making beads and hand-making blankets and pottery, and doing a lot of the making of things that we rely on machines to make today. And when you go around Mexico, you see these people everywhere you go. So it's not like they're off on a reservation, although you do have some of that as well in Mexico. So the extent to which an indigenous culture has been integrated into a larger culture has depended on a lot of factors: the government stance, the weather, the plight, where they were located, etc. And we have three very different examples of that between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Now to move on, let's talk about how we think of subcultures by their language sometimes. We refer to, for example, Spanish-speaking cultures. And the book, I thought, did a great job of pointing out how difficult it is really to characterize people who come from Spanish heritage or from Spanish language-speaking families or who live in Spanish countries. There is no one-word catch-all. No one is adequate, but there's a ton of them that we use. We use mestizo in Mexico to refer to an indigenous person, to refer to a Mexican who has an indigenous background. We use Hispanic to refer to a certain type of person who comes from a Hispanic culture, a Spanish-speaking culture, and what that means about the foods that are eaten and the approach to time and the human relationships. We have the word Chicano, mostly to refer to Hispanics living in California. Chic means small, so I'm not quite sure how the chica means small. I'm not quite sure how that came about. We also have Latino, and here in the United States we have Tejano, referring to Texans of a Mexican background. So we have a whole lot of terms, but none of them really adequately captures those peoples that we're trying to describe. It makes it very difficult, and I've seen that here at ESU. It was very difficult for the Modern Language Department to come up with a course about Spanish language cinema, or Hispanic cinema, or what do we call it. We do know that Hispanics in the U.S., now to use that term specifically as Spanish speakers or people who come from Spanish heritage, Spanish speakers in the U.S. are growing. One could say, that they never really went away if you think about it, because almost half of the United States was owned by Mexico. As far up as Wyoming was owned by Mexico, as well as Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Texas. That was all Mexico. It was only when the Mexican-American War took place that those parcels were separated off and annexed by the United States. That's what the Mexican-American War was all about, and the famous character General Santa Anna, who fought 4 wars and kept coming back and eventually lost this to the United States and all those states. He was quite a character. If you ever read history about General Santa Anna, he was such a megalomaniac, so high in himself, that in one of his wars he lost his leg and had a separate burial with a parade down the middle of the city just for his leg. Yeah, General Santa Anna. So anyway, we know that there are some values that are present in Hispanic cultures in the U.S. that can be statistically demonstrated. For example, they have the highest workforce participation out of any ethnicity in the United States. More Hispanics are working, and that kind of goes opposite to what some stereotypes hold, that some Hispanics are seen as not working or engaging in crime. Well, we know that the highest percentage of the workforce among ethnicities is Hispanics. We also know that Hispanics live a longer life compared to other ethnicities, including white people. Their diet has a lot to do with that. It's not so high in salt and fat. They eat a lot of greens. They eat a lot of fish. They eat a lot of rice. They eat a lot of tortillas, I guess, which is not necessarily good for you, but it's not the same thing as greasy French fries. We know that Hispanics value extended families. In Mexico, if you invite one person over who's a Mexican, their whole family may show up. It's just assumed. A couple hours late, of course, but everybody will come over smiling, sitting around, talking. That's the extended family. The grandmother can live at home. The grandmother's mother can live at home. An aunt, an uncle, cousins, people who are not blood related but who are also considered to be family can be living in a Hispanic household. And we know that there are several holidays that take place that are becoming more popular, not just from Mexico and other Latin American countries, but taking place actually here in the United States. Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, which is a day that commemorates the freedom of Mexico from France. That's a pretty celebrated holiday. The Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead, is celebrated very highly in the United States. It kind of is similar to our Halloween, but it's different. It's a way of honoring your ancestors. And if you've ever seen those figurines in stores which are skeletons, that's one of the artifacts that's come out of celebrating this holiday. And in the media, we continue to see a growth in the media. Right here in Stroudsburg, there is a Spanish language radio program on the Poconos 96.7. That's fairly new. We have two huge networks that have grown up in the United States, TV networks, Univision and Telemundo. We have several print publications across cities. We're just seeing more and more Mexican and more Venezuelan and Cubano and Puerto Rican media content. And of course, if you don't know, the most famous media content from the Spanish-speaking world is the telenovela or television novel, which is a soap opera. And it's produced in Mexico and other countries. Brazil does big ones too, and they're viewed all over the world. Even here in America, lots of Mexicans, and primarily females, but males too, are watching these telenovelas to stay in touch with their Hispanic heritage. And I bet some of you in this class know exactly what I'm talking about because you have Hispanic heritage. So anyway, that's going to wrap up this chapter on cultures within subcultures. Have a great day, and adios.